I am now joined by two of my absolute favorites. Amisha Cross is a political analyst on SiriusXM and a Democratic strategist. And Molly Jong-Fast is here with me in studio. She is a special correspondent for Vanity Fair, the host of the Fast Politics podcast, and an MSNBC contributor. Amisha, let's talk about the space that women, particularly black women, are forced to occupy. And I think that this is a very nuanced point that people need to understand. At the same time that black women are judged and criticized and dismissed when they are labeled and perceived to be angry, they are also lauded and sought after and solicited because Democrats know they cannot win without them. Can you just talk about that dichotomy?
Absolutely. And it's a tough balancing act for black women in particular, because there hasn't been a single civil rights movement or movement towards progress in this country that black women have not been at the center of, or had strong organizing power in, or were the bodies that actually created the movement. And they didn't actually receive a lot of that credit until present day. I think that for a party that has been used to not really having to show up as often as they should for the progress of black women, right now, looking at the fact that black women's organizing power could not be stronger, that, President Biden won in 2020 in large part because of the focus of black women, particularly in the battleground states, who are working day in and day out, not only to carry his message, but to get people registered, to get people out to the polls, and to help them to understand what was happening here. Black women who allowed for their bodies to be at risk, particularly in states like Georgia, where the threats to voter advocacy were reeled by a lot of the negativity of the Trump camp and those who put targets on the back of those black women who were getting people registered, who were also working the polls. I think that we're in a point in this nation's history where black women's resonating power, their advocacy power, cannot be denied. But for the Democratic Party specifically, it's also watching them elevate black women to positions of power, watching them acknowledge the role of black women in the sustainability of the party, but moreover, the sustainability of our democracy. But I would argue, Charles, that when you say power, when you say anger, I think of righteous anger, because there's a difference between righteous anger and angry just to be angry. And I say which women? Because on the right, you have women who are advocating for and fighting for things that are in direct opposition of what our democracy stands for. There were white women, conservative women, who were there on January 6th, loudly and proudly willing to try to take our country back to whatever the hell they think it needs to be. These are the same women who are fighting anti-CRT, who are pushing for book bans, who are absolutely fine with the Katie Britts of the world, who are cool with removing women's right to choose. There are women, particularly conservative women, who are also angry, who are pushing against the very things that our democracy holds so near and dear. So I argue which women when we talk about righteous anger and anger, because it definitely depends on which women you're talking about.
I think that's a very interesting point and a good one as well. And I love the term righteous anger. I was sort of vacillating between this notion of anger, which I kind of didn't want to use, and passion, which is something that I did lean into. But I love righteous anger because I think that it puts a very different and appropriate framing around everything that is going on and why people are feeling the way that they are. Molly, let's talk about these two very competing narratives. On one hand, you have Donald Trump, who is leaning into very heavily, without any surprise to most, this strongman rhetoric. And he's using and has relied on very, very strongman language, which seems to somehow appeal to a lot of lapdogs. We saw it during the faux Republican primary with Tim Scott and with Vivek and with a bunch of people who were at one point his opponents, but sort of got behind him, even Ron DeSantis, with this image of a strong man. That's a very opposite narrative to what he wants to paint in terms of causing more or less a gender war. What do you think about the likelihood of success there in terms of framing? Is this something that should be leaned into, or do you think that in terms of a strategic move, it should be left alone?
So what's happening with Trump is that he's doing this sort of autocratic, loving autocrats, and that is a weird thing the Republican Party is doing in the hopes that it will help them. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. What's happening with women is that they have, I think there's a realization. Look, losing the right to choose, losing bodily autonomy, the fall of Roe, it's a right that women lost that they had had for almost 50 years. So think about what that's like to take away a right that had been enshrined in the Constitution and is now gone. So I do think that that is a trauma. And what I think is really, I do agree that the Black women really did win for Democrats. They really did, and they cannot be taken for granted. And that is really, really important. And in fact, like, you know, I write a lot about the vice president and the press secretary, and these are two incredible Black women who have served this administration in amazing ways, made history, and are subjected to mind-blowing levels of sexism and racism every single day. In fact, so much so that it's shocking to me. And I think that I think that it really shows how far we have to go as a culture.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your honesty in saying how shocking it is. I will say that for most Black Americans, it's actually not shocking. And the reason I say that is because if you look at even going back to MLK and Malcolm X, they talked about, even in progressive spaces, the danger of folks who sort of were in spaces and not willing to acknowledge that they had their own biases. They could be even more dangerous than the curbside bigots. Yeah. And that's where I think some of the surprise comes, because even in the spaces that should be warm for Black women, right, politically, they're still facing that sort of scrutiny and backlash.
But the casual racism, for example, yesterday, Bill Maher suggested that they swap out, right, the highest elected Black woman in this country ever with Nikki Haley. Yeah. Like, that is, you would never say that about a white man. I mean, that is, I was speechless when I saw it.
Donald Glover, This Is America. Amisha, I want to get you back in here. Let's talk about some numbers. In 2020, Biden won the women's vote by an 11-point margin, and that was absolutely a decisive factor in him winning the overall election and beating Donald Trump. But let's look at the racial breakdown. 90% of Black women voted for Biden, but Trump actually won with white women. Biden only got 44% of white women. Why do you think that they are sticking with Donald Trump, or they did? And now that we are in a post-Dobbs era, do you think that that's going to hold true again this year?
I like the breakdown that you just showed, because quite frankly, there's a lot of credit in media given to all women, and we can't all women this, because a significant portion of white women were absolutely fine lining up with Donald Trump, regardless of his rhetoric, regardless of his anti-woman policies. And quite frankly, that's because white women in particular benefit from a white supremacist patriarchal society. They just do, and they don't vote against those interests. However, I think that this election cycle, what we may see is a shift solely due to not January 6th, not the rhetoric that former President Trump has on the campaign trail, not the xenophobia, but when it comes to women's reproductive rights. We saw the shift in IVF, and that was in one of the reddest of red states when we talk about the state of Alabama. The pushback from women was extremely strong. So I think that the Biden campaign is strategic in leaning in very hard on the women's reproductive rights restrictions, because I think that there is going to be a quake. However, it has yet to be determined how strong that quake will be. But we need to pay attention when we're talking about women and what women are doing and how they vote, and acknowledge that there is a significant portion of white women who are not turned off in the least by what Donald Trump is doing. What they may be turned off by is not being able to decide when they plan for their futures and their families, how much they expand them. And for those who have spent an exorbitant amount of money freezing eggs in the process of IVF, the ups and downs of that hormonally and otherwise, those women are really teed off about the sheer fact that in some cases they may not be allowed to use those eggs at all. I think that is what may drive some of these people who, quite frankly, otherwise would have voted for Trump.
Molly, I'm going to give you the last word here. I have to ask you about one of your recent pieces where you write about Trump and abortion as a voting issue. You wrote, Trump enjoys something that almost no presidential candidate has ever had: widespread name recognition without a voting record. And oddly, having once been a very pro-choice Democrat may have helped him with swing voters. But what Trump may or may not do in the White House is no longer hypothetical. He orchestrated the end for Roe, appeasing the right when de-endangering women's lives. He can't run away from that. Talk to me more about that. Donald Trump is still trying to avoid taking a clear position on the national abortion ban. Do you think that he's going to be successful in doing that, just in terms of his attempts to evade?
Well, he's trying. I mean, that thing where he said 15 weeks, that's a nice number. It's a nice, and, there was a piece about how he had come to 15 weeks. He's trying, right? He wants to get credit with his people for overturning Roe and still make a case that he is a moderate when it comes to women's health. Now, we know that's not true. And, you see in states like, Texas, women being sent back to the parking lot to wait until their miscarriage is bad enough to get treatment. So obviously it's not a real thing. But yes, I think he will. And look, the Katie Britt rebuttal was Republicans trying to tell women, look, we're not all bad, And what was interesting to me was she was really stuck. Like, she couldn't really, she was trying to make a moral case for the Republican Party. And the next day, the head of the party had to put up a bond for $91 million. I mean, you can't make this up. I don't think there's a world for the moral high ground in this Republican Party.
No, I don't. And I think that the notion of a moral high ground is somewhere that Democrats have to be careful in terms of looking for too much and ultimately decide to get in the mud and get into the fight. Amisha Cross, Molly Jung, Fast. Thank you.